I wish to raise with you the ongoing need for consultation with communities that are hosting persons with temporary protection and international protection applicants. And I want to give an example, the area where I come from and where I live, East Clare. Soon after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine last year, 40 Ukrainians arrived in Flagmount. Earlier this year, 220. The East Clare Holiday Village was repurposed and 220 arrived. And very recently, the former hotel in Scariff was repurposed and is taking up to 75 asylum seekers. Throughout that time, the medical centre in Scariff, which serves all of those areas, has received no communication whatsoever from either IPAS or the HSE with regard to that. Now, you'll know that medical centres across Ireland generally, and in particular rural Ireland, are under pressure. There are difficulties. There are more GPs retiring than coming through for rural practice. So there are difficulties around that. They obviously want to provide a service to everybody in their community, people who've been there for a long time, people who've recently arrived. But it's not, we simply can't pretend that new people arriving doesn't create additional pressures in a community. It does. And I suppose if people don't speak English, means that fluently or at all in some instances, it's going to create additional difficulties in the consultation periods are longer. Now, I'm not saying that IPAS can arrive with a new GP because people are being housed. I'm not expecting the impossible. But I think communities are entitled to know what is the plan to develop services, because nobody's expecting the war to end tomorrow. Nobody's expecting immigration to end tomorrow. So what is the plan, or is there a plan? Now, I'm not looking to blame here, but we do need an all-of-government approach, because we do need to make sure that people who are coming are integrated and receive the services they require, just as we need to make sure that there isn't a reduction or a diminution in service in the communities that are receiving them, because that would be profoundly unfair. Because obviously there's a disparity across the country. Some areas receiving far more than others, some areas with the capacity to take more than others. But there is a disparity, and that needs to be matched with resources. Yes, Minister Humphreys has monies, but it needs to be more profound than just arriving with a checkbook, because arriving with a checkbook isn't going to provide additional medical services where it's needed. Arriving with a checkbook isn't going to provide teaching English language to foreign students as a speciality, because these are specialist services. And I'm not saying that the government should be able to provide them instantly, but there has to be a plan, and communities are entitled to know what that plan is.
Margaret, T-shirt.
Thanks, Deputy, and I just want to thank you for the measured approach and the very reasonable questions that you asked. It is important that we talk about this issue, but we talk about it in a considered way. We should never lose sight of the fact that what we're experiencing across Europe is the worst refugee crisis since the 1940s. 4 million people have been displaced from their homes in Ukraine, and roughly 2% of them have come to Ireland. Around 80,000. And of course, in addition to that, there are people coming from the Balkans and outside of the European Union seeking international protection, some of whom come to Ireland. And that has created an enormous challenge for us. We've had to find accommodation for about 100,000 people in the past year or so, and we have. Mightn't always be the kind of accommodation that we want, but we've been able to provide shelter, food, accommodation, education and healthcare for nearly 100,000 additional people in the past year. And I think when history looks back on that period, it will reflect well on us, not so much as a government, but as a country, that we were able to take in 100,000 people fleeing war and seeking international protection. And I do want to acknowledge in particular the very real welcome that people in County Clare have given people coming from Ukraine. And for that reason, 3 million was allocated to Clare as part of the Community Recognition Fund. But it does creates pressures on schools, creates pressures on GP services. When it comes to schools, I think heroic work has been done by Minister Foley, by the Department of Education and by teachers and principals. There are now 14,000 Ukrainian children in Irish schools and generally doing very well, learning English, making friends, becoming part of the community. And that's a big achievement in my view. And yes, it has put pressure on GP services. When I was a practicing GP, one of my jobs once a week was to go to a clinic and look after the health needs of newly arrived asylum seekers in Kilmacud at the time. And it's tough because the consultation takes 2 or 3 times as long as it would with an Irish person because of language difficulties, the need for a translator, even cultural differences in how people describe their symptoms. And that makes that consultation 2 or 3 times longer, and that puts huge pressure on GPs. And there isn't a quick fix to it. But the kind of things that we are doing, other than, of course, providing medical cards for people who need them coming here from Ukraine and elsewhere, is increasing the number of GPs we're training. That'll be up to 300 a year quite soon, a doubling of the number of GPs we train every year. And we're examining a very interesting proposal that's come forward from the University of Galway to establish a new graduate entry programme into medical school for those who live in rural Ireland and want to do remote and rural medicine. And that would create a dedicated stream of people who are a little bit older, going into medical school, want to stay in Ireland, and particularly want to engage in remote and rural medicine. And they have a really interesting proposal in that regard. But it does take time when you start training people now for them to be available.
I suppose, Taoiseach, it does take time. I'm glad you acknowledge that there is a problem, but we need to go further than acknowledging there's a problem and maybe establish liaison between the HSE and IPAS. I'm not blaming IPAS, I'm not blaming the ministers, and they're both sitting there at all, but we do need a whole of government approach, because what we can't have is service providers, in particular vital services like GPs, having to choose between providing a service to their existing patients, or maybe their growing families of existing patients, and new patients who are coming in, because that will create division and resentment, and understandable resentment, and we just can't have that. Now, during the recess, we learned of difficulties in the work permit system around healthcare professionals. I appreciate it's slightly different, but it goes back to what Deputy Grealish raised. I mean, we do also need a vast improvement in the work permit regime. We have people being granted work permits who are being refused visas, and there's a lot of them by the Department of Justice. And there seems to be a disconnect between the two regimes. There's 2 separate statutory regimes. I think your government really needs to look at that. But the question that I raised is around making sure that areas that there is a plan for areas that are accepting persons seeking international protection and those who have temporary protection, and that plan is clearly communicated to those communities.
Thanks, Deputy. I should say that we do have a cabinet subcommittee on Ukraine and migration, and I chair that, and health is part of that, and it's a pretty regular agenda item that we discuss the health impact and the health needs of people who've come here from abroad. Look, that's a fair point, and it's something that I will follow up on, because the situation in each community is different, as you know, depending on the needs, the capacity of the community, and the profile of people who we're bringing into that area. One thing that can help is registering Ukrainian doctors and nurses. They have come to Ireland as well, making sure that their qualifications are recognised and allowing them to work in our health service and get around the issues of translation, and that's being done. The other bit of work that is being done is to bring together the work permit and visa system into a single combined system. That's actually a European law that we've opted into. But I would say this, and I know this from experience, we turn around work permits very quickly now, in 2 or 3 weeks. Visas are a little bit more complicated, because we do actually have to check that people are who they say they are. And often the delay in issuing a visa to somebody isn't a delay on our side. It's the delay in the police department in the country they're coming from, because we do need to check that they are who they say they are. And nobody would forgive us for issuing visas to people without due diligence.